The situation exploded on a scorching Friday afternoon during Emma's 13th birthday pool party. Sarah had spent the morning transforming their backyard into a teenage paradise, with floating LED lights in the pool, a snack station loaded with pizza and drinks, and a magnificent two-tier cake decorated with fondant seashells. Emma had invited just 6 close friends, a small gathering that Sarah had personally cleared with all the parents. The party was in full swing when the first police siren wailed in the distance. Sarah was adjusting the underwater lights, trying to ignore Mrs. Winter's predictable surveillance from next door, when she heard Emma's frightened voice. "Mom, there are police cars outside." Through the gate, Sarah could see 2 patrol cars parked at odd angles in front of her house, their lights painting the neighborhood in alternating red and blue. Mrs. Winters stood on her front lawn in a pressed beige pantsuit, clutching her now infamous binder of evidence. Behind her, a woman in a dark blazer was climbing out of an unmarked car, a child protective services worker, Sarah would soon learn. "That's them, officer," Mrs. Winters called out, her voice trembling with manufactured distress. "They're running some sort of inappropriate establishment. Just look at how these children are dressed, practically naked, and the music, the activities, it's absolutely indecent." The teenage girls, all wearing standard one-piece swimsuits and swim shorts, huddled together near the pool steps. Emma's best friend, Lily, was already on her phone, tears streaming down her face as she begged her mother to come quickly. The birthday cake sat forgotten on the table, its carefully crafted decorations beginning to melt in the afternoon heat. Officer Rodriguez, a veteran cop Sarah recognized from community events, looked distinctly uncomfortable as he approached the gate. "Mrs. Thompson, we received a concerning call about inappropriate activities involving minors. We're required to investigate." Sarah's hands shook as she unlocked the gate, her mind racing. Behind her, she could hear Emma's muffled sobs. This was supposed to be her daughter's special day, a celebration of friendship and growing up. Instead, it was turning into a nightmare that would haunt these girls' memories forever. Parents began arriving in a panic, having received frantic texts from their children. Mrs. Martinez, Lily's mother and a local attorney, took one look at the scene and pulled out her phone, documenting everything. Mr. Chen, whose daughter Amy was trembling in the pool, stepped forward. "This is harassment, plain and simple. Our children are being terrorized at a birthday party." But Mrs. Winters wasn't finished. She thrust her binder at the CPS worker, her voice rising to a theatrical pitch. "I have documented every instance of inappropriate behavior. Photos, times, dates, all of it. These children need protection from this environment." The CPS worker, Ms. Harris, flipped through the binder with increasingly furrowed brows. "Ma'am," she said slowly, "taking photographs of minors without parental consent is a serious concern. We may need to have a different conversation here." Sarah Thompson's peaceful Sunday morning shattered at the sound of her neighbor's shrill voice carrying over the fence. Her children froze mid-splash in their new pool, water dripping from their stunned faces as Mrs. Eleanor Winter's head appeared above the privacy fence like a disapproving gargoyle. The newly installed pool had been a dream come true for the family, a reward for the kids' excellent academic year. But their new neighbor seemed determined to turn it into a nightmare. Sarah noticed something that made her stomach turn. Mrs. Winters wasn't just watching, she was filming with her phone, muttering about documentary evidence and moral decay. "Mom," whispered Emma, her eldest, wrapping herself in a towel despite the scorching summer heat. "She's doing it again." Sarah watched as her normally confident 13-year-old daughter hunched her shoulders, trying to make herself smaller. Her younger siblings, Michael, 11, and Sophie, 9, huddled close to their sister, their earlier joyful shrieks replaced by uncomfortable silence. Sarah had spent years saving for this pool, picking up extra shifts at the hospital where she worked as a nurse. After her husband's passing 3 years ago, she'd promised herself she'd find ways to bring joy back into their children's lives. The pool was supposed to be that bright spot, a place for healing, laughter, and new memories. Instead, it had become ground zero for their neighbors' obsessive surveillance. Mrs. Winters had moved in just 2 weeks after the pool's installation, and her presence was felt immediately. She'd started with friendly warnings about the dangers of drowning, leaving laminated newspaper clippings about pool accidents in Sarah's mailbox. Then came the daily inspections from her second-story window, complete with a pair of binoculars and a notepad where she documented every splash and swim stroke. Sarah tried reasoning with her. She'd invited Mrs. Winters over for coffee, explained their safety measures, the locked gate, the pool alarm, the swimming lessons all 3 children had taken. She'd even offered to show Mrs. Winters their pool permit and insurance documentation. But the elderly woman had just pursed her lips, clutching her designer handbag as she declared, "In my day, children knew how to behave with modesty and decorum." Now, watching Mrs. Winters film her children, Sarah felt something snap inside her. She'd been patient, understanding, even sympathetic to what she assumed was an elderly woman's loneliness and boredom. But this crossed a line. She marched toward the fence, her bare feet slapping against the hot concrete. "Mrs. Winters," she called out, her voice firm but controlled, "I need you to stop filming my children immediately. That's not just inappropriate, it's illegal." The older woman's face twisted into a smirk. "Oh, my dear," she replied, her phone still recording, "I'm merely gathering evidence of what goes on in this neighborhood. Someone has to maintain standards." She paused, her next words dripping with false concern. "I do hope you have a good lawyer, Mrs. Thompson. You're going to need one." The story of Emma's ruined birthday party spread through the neighborhood's social media like wildfire, but not in the way Mrs. Winters had hoped. By Monday morning, the community center's meeting room was packed with concerned residents, many standing along the walls after all the chairs had been filled. Sarah sat in the front row, her children beside her, as family after family came forward with their own Mrs. Winters stories. "She followed my daughter Maya home from swim practice 3 times last week," Mrs. Rodriguez reported, pulling up security footage from her doorbell camera. The screen showed Mrs. Winters trailing 20 feet behind a clearly uncomfortable teenage girl, snapping photos and making notes. "My daughter's afraid to walk home alone now." The revelations kept coming. Mr. Chen's security cameras had captured Mrs. Winters using a telescoping pole with a mounted camera to peer over fences. The Patel family shared footage of her drone, hovering over their daughter's Sweet 16 party. Most disturbing was the discovery that she'd created detailed dossiers on nearly every child in the neighborhood, complete with photos, schedules, and what she termed incidents of moral concern. "Look at this," Lisa Martinez, now acting as the neighborhood's legal counsel, gestured to a wall where they'd mapped out Mrs. Winters' surveillance network. Red pins marked camera locations, blue showed her usual observation posts, and yellow highlighted the homes with children she'd targeted. The map looked like a spider's web, with Mrs. Winters' house at the center. The atmosphere in the room shifted from anger to shock when Sarah's youngest son, Michael, stood up. His small voice trembled, but carried clearly through the silent room. "Last night, I had a nightmare that the crazy lady was watching me through my window. Mom, is she going to make us move away? I don't want to leave our pool. It's the only thing that still makes Emma smile like before Dad died." Sarah pulled her son close, fighting back tears. Behind her, she heard several parents sniffling. Even the neighborhood association president, Mr. Harrison, usually stoic during these meetings, had to clear his throat several times before speaking. "This ends today," he declared, his voice firm. "We've contacted the authorities about the illegal surveillance. Mrs. Winters has violated multiple privacy laws, and her actions constitute harassment of minors. But more importantly, she's violated our community's trust." As if on cue, the doors burst open. Officer Rodriguez entered, accompanied by 2 detectives from the cybercrimes unit. "We have a warrant to search Mrs. Winters' property," he announced. "The evidence you've all provided suggests a pattern of behavior that goes beyond simple neighborhood disputes. We're treating this as a serious investigation." The room erupted in a mix of relief and vindication. Parents hugged their children, neighbors clasped hands, and for the first time in months, Sarah saw her daughter Emma's shoulders relax. a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth. The turning point came on a quiet Sunday morning, 2 weeks after the community meeting. Sarah was making breakfast when she heard an unfamiliar voice calling from her front porch. Opening the door, she found herself face to face with a woman in her 40s who shared Mrs. Winter's sharp features that possessed a warmth her mother lacked. "I'm Catherine Winters Chen," she said, extending her hand. "Eleanor's daughter. And this," she gestured to a teenage girl hanging back nervously, "is my daughter Madison. We need to talk about my mother." Over coffee, Catherine revealed the tragic story behind Mrs. Winter's obsession. 30 years ago, her younger brother had drowned at a neighbor's pool party while the adults were distracted. Mrs. Winters had never forgiven herself for chatting inside while her son slipped underwater. The trauma had festered, transforming into an obsessive need to control and monitor children's safety. "When Mom started sending me videos of your kids, claiming she was protecting the neighborhood, I knew it had gotten